it feels like it's welcoming old friends back. We're getting a really nice group, so it's lovely to see you all. Edwin and I are 2/3 of Books and Beverages who set these up, and we're very fortunate that Harrogate Library allow us to use the venue for free, because we do everything on a shoestring, like no money, so that's great. It's my great pleasure today, she's standing very modestly behind me, it's my pleasure to welcome Susanna Lewis, who is a local poet and writer, and she's going to do a presentation for us, and she's got some fantastic things, so afterwards do come and have a look at her display. But today she's going to talk about her latest book, Ernie's War. Over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susanna, and I'm the author of Ernie's War. This is a poetry book recounting events during the Second World War, with a focus on this guy here. So, who was Ernie? Ernie was my father-in-law. He was a soldier in the Green Howards Regiment. But the family knew so little about him, and so as a gift for my husband, who is in the audience today, I decided a few years ago to do some research to find out what happened to Ernie during the Second World War. It was actually quite heartbreaking to discover the details of what happened to Ernie. He was in fact a prisoner of war for 5 years in a Polish camp. So my book, Ernie's War, how did it start? What's the background to it? After this research, I decided, as a gift to my husband, to write 4 poems. The 4 poems would tell the story of Ernie. And from those poems, it just escalated. Anyone here who writes poetry will know that poetry is such an easy way to get your emotions down on paper. It's very short. The words are very to the point, and you can often tell a story in just a few lines. And so that's what I did. I started doing more and more research about what had happened around Ernie and about his life abroad. And I started finding out more and more details about the war. I've always had an interest in the Second World War anyway, but I decided to put all what I'd learned into poetry. So, before I go and tell you more about Ernie, let's go back to 1939. I worked for many years in museums and historical reenactments, so I have played the part of everything from a wench in the Middle Ages to a witch being burned at the stake, and my favourite one was leader of the French resistance during the Second World War. So I believe in bringing history to life. That's what I do. I think otherwise history can be a little bit boring if we just give you a history book, but actually to bring it to life. So that's why I brought a display with me, which is just part of the things that I own, and I just would welcome you after the event to come and have a look. We've got some amazing replica newspapers. It's like a proper newspaper. You can sit and read it as you want. So we're going to go back to 1939. Just try and put yourself back into 1939, which is really difficult because the world has progressed so much, so quickly. Think about technology, the first thing. Think about people that were fighting the war abroad. They had no communications like we do now. There was no Sky News recording everything. People at home didn't get information about those people fighting abroad. It must have been terrifying. And so the official start of the Second World War was in September. It's now known as the deadliest war in human history, with approximately 70 to 85 million deaths. Most of you will know that Europe had been restless since the end of the First World War. Germany particularly were restless with their territory. They wanted more and more and more. And they set out, obviously with Adolf Hitler in charge, using aggressive ideology, and they wanted to expand their territory across Europe. Britain and France had signed a pact with Poland to protect Poland. Poland were very, very vulnerable, and Hitler had actually said he would invade Poland. So we'd signed a pact with France saying we would defend Poland. Unfortunately, Germany did invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and the world was plunged into the Second World War. So let's now hear from Neville Chamberlain, who was our Prime Minister at the time. Most people associate the Second World War with Winston Churchill. Neville Chamberlain was actually our Prime Minister when we declared war on Germany. Neville Chamberlain was a very peaceful man and was desperate for peace, and some would call him a little naive. I think that's the word I would use. People say he was weak, and I think he was just naive. In 1938, he signed a pact with Hitler in Munich, a peace pact. He was absolutely overjoyed, came back to Britain waving this pact saying, look what I've done, it's amazing, there will be no war with Germany. Hitler went back to his headquarters, waved the same pact at his generals and said, this is not worth the paper it's written on. That was the mind of the crazy man that he was. So sadly he was a little naive because they were already preparing for war when he signed that pact. So we're now going to listen to the start of the war.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
And there we are, the start of the war for us, for this country, 3rd of September 1939. For almost 6 years, we were involved in the most difficult war we had ever experienced. The war affected everyone from all walks of life. My book tells the story of all these brave men, women, children, and animals who fought together to keep this country safe and free from tyranny. The military who fought on the front line, the prisoners in German camps experienced the very worst of human evil, children evacuated away from their families, the women who toiled in munitions factories and other heavy-duty jobs, young land girls who worked in the fields growing extra food for a country hit hard by food shortages, retired and infirm men who were unable to actively fight, but who formed a group of determined foot soldiers defending this country. We know them as the Home Guard, or affectionately known as Dad's Army. Our gutsy politicians who had some very, very difficult life and death decisions. Our allies, France, Poland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, later Belgium, Netherlands and other European countries, and eventually the USA and Russia. And last but not least, all the animals that were part of the war effort, the horses, down to the carrier pigeons that were used to communicate. I really believe we should remember and honour them all, regardless of any medals they earned or didn't earn, as they helped Britain return to peace. So here is Ernie, here is my father-in-law. He was born in 1917 in Driffield in East Yorkshire, and he joined the Green Howards Regiment in 1936. So by the time Britain was actively involved in the war, Ernie had a few years training, although please be mindful that the training then was absolutely nothing like it is now. In January 1940, Ernie went to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force to help the French and Belgians halt the advance of the German army. A few months later, Ernie found himself as part of the rearguard action at Dunkirk. Their sole and only order was to keep back the Germans so we could evacuate all the British soldiers that were stuck on Dunkirk beach. I'm sure we all know the story of the British soldiers getting stuck on Dunkirk beach, and he was the one of the group who had to keep the Germans away. Many of the BEF knew they wouldn't get home. I have to say they either thought they would be captured or killed because they were last men standing, which must have been terrifying. Ernie was captured just outside Dunkirk in May 1940. He was transported to northeast Poland to a German prisoner of war camp just outside Gdansk. The journey in itself was horrific. Men were bundled onto cattle trucks with standing room only for all those hours. They hardly had any food and no toilet facilities. Ernie arrived at the prisoner of war camp, firstly at a place called Stalag 20A at Torun for a year, then moving to his second camp, Stalag 20B, which was just outside Marienberg. Here he stayed for another 4 years, enduring the most horrific conditions, suffering hunger, lack of medical treatment, and most probably violence at the hands of German guards. He remained captive until January 1945, when his life unbelievably got even worse. He became part of what is known as the Long March. We know it probably as the Death March. As the Soviet army advanced into Poland and the German army were losing ground, by this stage they were definitely losing the war, the German soldiers decided to try and evade capture by the Russians, who were a ruthless army and wouldn't take any prisoners, they would just shoot the Germans. They decided to use the prisoners of war as a human shield. In the harsh winter of 1945, with temperatures down to -25, over 300,000 prisoners of war were marched out of the camp into a journey that would last months. The prisoners, already suffering from malnutrition, wore inadequate clothing for the journey. They had no shoes, they wrapped linen around their feet, and many prisoners died on the journey. If they were too weak to keep up with the march, the Germans simply shot them. Food was scarce. The prisoners ate grass, rats and insects to try and stay alive. They relied on the generosity of Polish villagers who would throw them scraps of food. Dysentery was rife. They were just used. They were sometimes, as they were marching, they were not allowed to stop to go to the toilet, and the Germans would make them carry on walking. And so a lot of them succumbed to dysentery. Those that survived eventually made it to Germany, and Ernie ended up in Berlin. He was repatriated by the Allies, namely the Americans. He was one of the lucky ones, but he must have been forever haunted by what he saw during his time as a prisoner. I will now read the 4 poems that inspired this book. They are meant to be read together because they tell the story of Ernie and his experience. Captured. And this picture shows the rearguard forces at Dunkirk. They look a bit laid back. He's smoking. He's having a bit of a sit down and a smoke. But this was their life, to try and hold back the Germans so that we could get most of the troops back home. This is called Captured. A long way from home in a foreign land, dodging bullets and bombs that are meant for me. My orders are clear: protect the boys on the beach, targeted by the consuming evil, with one objective: to kill. Running through cornfields, nowhere to hide, deafening hum overhead. Panic and fear freeze my mind, grey beasts block my path. Dark eyes steal my soul, dragged from freedom. Cold metal at my head, beaten and pistol whipped, I sink to my knees. My life is not as before. I am captured. I am nothing. Imprisoned. This picture shows a typical scene, prisoner of war camp in Poland. I'm not sure if this is Ernie's prisoner of war camp, but this is typical. Imprisoned. Grey walls suffocate my life. Like a caged animal, there is no way out. to die. Is this how it's supposed to end? And I'd just like to make a note there that the prisoners, actually, when they interviewed them afterwards, they all said they felt safer in the prisoner of war camp, which sounds crazy to you and I here, but every time they took them out and they made them line and march, they believed they were being marched to their execution. So they must have been terrified around every corner. They thought they were going to stop, line them up and shoot them. Repatriated. In the distance I saw him through wet and salty tears. The dark figure advanced, my heart stopped, fear set in. I had seen this darkness before. Murderous eyes and an evil heart. Was my end drawing close on this desolate Berlin street? A flicker of red and white, blue stars, floated past my eyes. A familiar view that warmed my heart, 5 years waiting for the sight. Emerging into the sunlight, that warm smiling face. Strong arms holding me aloft as I crumbled like a child. Hope stands before me, booming voice seals my fate. Time to go home, son, time to go home. There were also some reports when they marched into Berlin, they told them all to turn round and look the other way, and many of them thought that they were going to get shot in Berlin. And what had happened was the Germans lined them all up and then they fled, because Berlin at that time was full of Americans. And it was only when they dared to turn around that they realised that they were in safe hands. The beach. This is the beach at Dunkirk. I don't know if anyone's been to Dunkirk. It's quite a long expanse. This is just one section, one very small section of it. Those of you who do know the story, it was an absolute struggle. It would have been the end of the war if Churchill hadn't succeeded in getting them off, to be honest. This was, it's called the Miracle of Dunkirk, and it was the mass evacuation of just under 350,000 British soldiers. That's an awful lot to get off. The German army had surrounded all the Allies and had trapped them on this beach. The only way to get them out was via the sea, which was difficult, sheltered of ships, and the Germans were launching frequent air attacks on the stranded and helpless men on the beach. They shot many while they were waiting, and they also torpedoed and shot the ships. In a desperate attempt to rescue the stranded men, fishing boats, pleasure boats and civilian crafts were called into action from the south coast of England. They crossed the dangerous channel and they risked their lives to pick up the soldiers at Dunkirk. Bearing in mind that these were all civilians. They were fishermen, there were people who just had a boat to take the family out on a weekend. This operation was known as Little Ships of Dunkirk, and their role in saving lives should never be forgotten. The next poem is about one soldier on the beach of Dunkirk waiting to be rescued. Salty air brushes his cheeks, soft sand playing gently with his toes. Breathing in the fresh cool air, he floats freely along the beach. His tired mind rests in still time, forgetting a while his tortured past. His weary arms hang loose by his side, his aching limbs carry him bravely on. Seagulls soar in the cloudless sky, swooping low, effortless in their flight, strong and determined, while swimming against the wind. Stopping to recall his journey, his trauma, hurt and pain. He notices footprints in the sand and remembers his reason to live. Back home, his young son is waiting for his daddy to return from the war. To hear that caring voice again, telling bedtime stories once more. Playing in the sand at Scarborough Beach, building castles with an old tin bucket, leaving tiny footprints as a lasting memory, telling the story of a perfect day. And here, across the water, on this French blood-soaked beach, this brave soldier, father of one, waits quietly for a miracle. The War in the Sky. Of course, the RAF played a huge part in the Second World War, and we all know about the famous Battle of Britain that took place between July and October 1940. It included the large-scale bombing of British cities. The Battle of Britain contributed significantly to the postponement of Hitler's planned invasion of Britain. Referring to the RAF and their efforts, Winston Churchill famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The next poem hopefully explores the terror and fear that every pilot must have experienced as they fought the enemy in the sky. Flying high in the blue wide yonder, swooping low over pea-green pastures, oil-encrusted birds screaming in pain, smoke-filled plumes speak with urgency. Another journey, another unknown outcome, looking to the heavens for sanctuary. Thoughts of loved ones never far away, tattered photos fixed to the altimeter. Free as a bird, yet feeling imprisoned, losing sense of reality and the truth. The metal cage, a movable jail cell, closing, crushing the human life within. Mackerel sky obscures the menacing view. Field of vision blurred with tears of terror. Shaking hands control the smoking beast, fighting the war in a blood-filled sky. Well, apart from our military, of course, the home front. The people at home were also hugely responsible for the success of the war and for restoring peace to this country. Without women and children, land girls, we would not have won the war. The people of Britain came together as never before, and they showed strength and courage as they rallied around to help the war effort in any way they could. I think we've all got an idea of what happened during the war with our sense of community. People came together, people worked together, people helped each other. Life was very, very difficult, and I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been to constantly live with the threat of bombing, invasion, and having a loved one abroad. I've included some poems here that hopefully portray what life was like for people of Britain during the war. Reading personal accounts of their daily life has been quite inspiring and heartbreaking, and we must never underestimate what the ordinary people in Britain did to help us win the war. The shelter. Here we can see some different shelters. I think we've all seen pictures like this of the London Underground, where people in London, obviously they were the biggest population, and London was under attack more than any other city in this country. And they would go down there, and they would spend the night down there, sometimes 2 days down there, depending what was going on. They would play games, they would play music, but there was a problem with disease. Obviously, there was no ventilation and no real toilet facilities. It wasn't great down there. People often built their own shelters in the garden. Funny enough, I once bought a house many years ago, and when I did some landscaping in the garden, I found an old area shelter in the garden. And they would build it, cover it with earth, and they would make it quite cosy inside, and that was really just for the family or for the neighbours as well. But either way, it still must have been very scary. Sometimes I wonder how much of a protection that would have been against a bomb that was dropping. So I'm going to read you now The Shelter. In the dead of night I hear it, high-pitched squeal so loud I have ringing in my ears. Make it stop, I cry. Falling down the stairs, pulling my nightie around me, trying to save my dignity for what it's worth. Foggy damp air fills the street, full of screaming babies. Mothers pleading with God to spare the lives of the young. Crowds gather ready to descend into the black abyss of hell. The vile smell of the tunnel fills my lungs with poison. I struggle to breathe freely, fearing I may die. But the shelter brings life and offers us hope from the war that rages above, while we huddle together, pretending we are elsewhere. Ignoring the shaking walls that threaten to cave in, suffocating every man, woman and child. Our eyes meet, nervous glances tell the same old story. Worn down by wartime life, our evening entertainment in a dark, damp shelter 100 feet below the ground. The evacuee. Children were often evacuated as a country to either spend time with family or quite regularly with complete strangers. They were taken out of the cities, obviously because of the risk to their lives. But there were some mothers who actually kept them back. They just didn't want to be separated from them. All they took with them was, you've seen so many pictures, there's this little suitcase, he's just got a little carry bag, bless him, little label and the gas mask. That's all they were allowed to take, one case. And I'm now going to read you an evacuee poem. My mum packed me case with tears in her eyes. You're off on holiday, son, but I knew it were lies. She buttoned me coat and tapped me on my head. You're just like your father, except he's already dead. Waiting at the station, gas mask in my hand, label on my coat, on my way to another land. A long wave goodbye, teary eyes meet the floor. I miss me mum already. I hate this bloody war. Rations. You will see I've actually brought, I do have a ration book here. Oh yeah, and there's one there as well. These are all replicas, so you're quite welcome to have a look through them. It's quite interesting. It's shocking as well how little they survived on. It's quite humbling really when you read about exactly what they had to cook with every week and how spoilt we are now. Rations were introduced into Britain in January 1940 due to shortages from imported food. The German army believed they could cut off our country by bombing our food suppliers, and it did work quite well. And so everybody got a ration book which limited certain items. Things such as bananas were completely unobtainable during the war, and oranges were restricted to children and pregnant women. A campaign was started called Dig for Victory, which is a great campaign. I think we should bring it back actually, where everyone started to grow their own produce to counteract the short supply of fresh veg. It was a great morale booster because people felt they were doing something, they couldn't go to war, and this was their way of helping. Similar campaign called Make, Do and Mend, and I think oh yes, it's there at the front. That's it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Make, Do and Mend, which actually is quite popular now. A lot of people are doing a lot of Make, Do and Mend, which I think is great. And it was popular because people knew they had to conserve what they had. So I'm going to read you my rations. I've just picked up my ration card on this cold winter's day. I'm feeling rather worried. My weekly food I've got to weigh. 4 ounce of bacon and ham, 2 ounce of tea for my cuppa, 3 pints of milk for breakfast, 2 ounce of cheese and butter, dried eggs, meals without meat, be careful not to overcook, turnip pie, War and Peace pudding from Potato Pete's recipe book. Dr. Carrot, friend to all, put to use in every meal. Chocolate and carrot pudding, carrot jam with apple peel. Help win the war in the kitchen, we fight with fork and spoon. Courage behind this apron, but let's hope the war ends soon. And there he is. Winston Churchill, one of our most iconic and respected politicians of all time. He is seen as the leader that actually got through this war. He had some really difficult decisions to make. He had to go against a lot of his cabinet to get what he wanted, and the British people loved him. He became Prime Minister in May 1940. There was a lot of uncertainty around Chamberlain at that time. Norway had just been invaded by Hitler, and Chamberlain was starting to be seen as a bit weak. His own party rejected him, and the opposition party refused to work with him, so they had to get rid of him. He was actually quite sick at the time anyway, and died about 6 months later. So Winston Churchill came in May 1940. It was the most crucial part of the war. It was Dunkirk. and the war had really picked up momentum at that stage. Some politicians, including the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, wanted us to seek a negotiated peace with Hitler. I've done a lot of research into this, and it was actually quite scary what he was actually trying to implement. It would certainly not have ended in peace for this country. It would have ended in an invasion and Germany taking over. So he actively and quite aggressively went against Lord Halifax. His famous motivational speeches we've all heard were a great inspiration to the British people and even to the opposition party in the House of Commons. His dedication to winning the war was unrivalled, and he never slowed down in his relentless pursuit of peace, even though he suffered with quite ill health during the war years. When the war was declared officially over in May 1945, he told a crowd of people in Whitehall, "This is your victory," to which they replied back, "No, it is yours." And I'm going to read The Man with a Big Cigar. Out of the darkness, a proud beacon of light, to a world losing hope and freedom alike, trapped in a corner, unable to breathe, all escape routes closed, with no visible way out. The angel among us took a deep sigh, his work ready to begin. There's a war to fight. Pounding dark corridors, tapping the floor with his cane, steely blue eyes fixed, nothing stands in his way. Brushing aside his critics, with a sense of justice and truth, ready to take on the world, the man with the big cigar. And finally, peace. In 1945, May, Germany finally surrendered to the Allies, and this was celebrated throughout Europe and the world as VE Day. The war had been long and difficult, with many casualties on both sides. It is estimated approximately 380,000 British military died, with 67,000 British civilians. Many soldiers like Ernie returned home, but never forgot their experiences of war. They took civilian jobs, and life slowly got back to normal. Ernie returned to Driffield and married Mary, his sweetheart, and went on to become father to Paul and Tony, my husband. Perhaps the horror of those 5 years in the prison war camp were never far away from his mind. We can only applaud his strength of character to survive, always living with the fact that many of his friends died or were murdered during the war. Peace is something we should always treasure, and after researching this book and reading first-hand accounts of the horror, it certainly made me more appreciative of everything I have in my life now, including living in a country without oppression of war. I have to say, sometimes I've been doing some more research this week, and sometimes I have to stop because it's just too heartbreaking. It's very difficult to understand why people would be so evil to other people. As always, I do like to finish on a lighter note because I don't want you all going home quite fast. So I wrote a little poem about peace, and so I'll just read that just to finish now. It's called Nature at Peace. Birdsong says, "Good morning," bringing a message of hope. The birth of a new day reveals sapphire blue skies. Fragrant roses, pink in colour, fill the air with unbridled joy. Lush green meadows dance, smiling in the May sunshine. Bright-eyed field mice play, grateful of this tranquil world. Majestic trees bow silently, in honour of those not coming home. Serenity cocoons this war-torn land, but peace is the greatest gift of all. Thank you so much for listening. Please come up and have a look at anything. I just asked if you're don't take it to another part of the library because then I might lose it. But please feel free to have a look. If you've got any personal stories that you'd like to chat with me after, that'd be amazing. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Sue, to Edwin, it was amazing technology. got me through today. To my husband, who is here, really, to tell the story, because if Ernie hadn't survived, he wouldn't be here, and he would be married to someone so lovely. So, and just thank you to those who've gone before us that made it so we're all here today and living peacefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure Ernie would have been very impressed and very proud of what you've researched about him and what you've written about him.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Susanna?
Just I would like to know how long Ernie lived. How old was he when he died?
He died he was 82.
82.
82, yeah.
He had a lot of health problems, which they probably attributed to his time
Yes.
in the war.
That's why I asked.
He came home weighing 7 stone.
Went out 13 and a half stone, came back 7
But he had a lot of stomach ulcers, etc., which was probably attributed to, the lack of diet, the stress, yeah. But he didn't talk about it. I think that's quite common. That was quite common.
It is.
Some have, and some have written down their accounts, and I'm very grateful for that because, I can read accounts from other Green Howards who were captured or other prisoners of war. The stories are very, very similar. I read accounts on the Long March. The Long March isn't very well known, and it's a shame because it's a horrific part of our history that's not talked about a lot. But so many people suffered on that march. They suffered because they'd survived as well, because of what they'd witnessed and how they had to live. And as I explained, they were terrified. But reading the very scant accounts is just useful, and that's how we actually did a lot of research, and we actually got the Green Howards have their own researcher up in Richmond, and they were able to find out more about what happened to Ernie, and we saw documents for his Red Cross parcels and things, although a lot of Red Cross parcels didn't get through, they were taken by the Germans, sadly. So we could piece together what had happened to him, which was heartbreaking, but, especially for Tony and his brother, really necessary, because you've got a family member, a close family member that you love so much, you want to know what's happened. And it's terrible to read it, and Tony will agree that we've read some accounts and I've had to put the book down because I just can't read anymore. But at the same time, doing things like this, and writing the book is just to honour them, because we're not going to forget them, there's no way, because what they did for us means we're all sat here and enjoying a free life. It would have been so different if Ernie and his colleagues hadn't been part of that BEF, the British Expedition Force, literally stood keeping back the Germans so we could get everyone off the beach at Dunkirk. Otherwise the war would have gone a different way. But he did suffer, and he suffered when he came home, and I think he suffered as well because he didn't talk. Nowadays when soldiers come home and they've got post-traumatic stress, they are sent to proper counsellors and they get a lot of help. I think they were given, was it £100 Tony in a suit, and they arrived back, say, on a Friday, and on Monday they had to go find a job with £100 in the pocket and a suit. There was no support like there is now, and that's quite shocking. But maybe that's just the time it was, I don't understand that. But they went on to have a lot of mental and physical problems afterwards because they had no support afterwards.
Can I make an aside, a comment? I was fascinated particularly about the home front,
Yeah.
which, as you say, there's lots and lots of information. We actually have a real ration card at home.
Oh,
Because
wow.
my husband, who is so old, but actually he was born in 1953, and rationing continued.
It did, yeah.
And was it sweet ration that you had?
Never had a sweet when we finished them all.
Well, I'm sure a small baby, you were very popular with your sweet ration. But of course, I tend to think 1945
It stopped, yeah. Carried on.
53,
54. I can
Yeah.
remember as a child bacon and stuff like that. You couldn't leave anything on your plate
Yeah.
because it was rationed. You only got a couple of rashers of bacon and a small piece of cheese
Yeah.
and that sort of thing.
But they just were so versatile. That's amazing how they worked to actually feed families then.
Yes.
And really, use what they had. makes me very humble because I think how spoiled we are nowadays. Yeah.
But you say, make your men recycle.
Yeah.
There's a great deal of emphasis now on cookery, which was lost for many years.
Yeah.
How to grow your own, how to cook your own.
And I think the pandemic actually brought a lot of that back.
I think it focused people's mind.
Because we couldn't go to shops when we wanted, we couldn't buy clothes.
No.
And I think it's well gave that wartime spirit that they had in the 1940s that we've lost. And I think that a little bit of that came back. I wish we could keep it for longer, really. Not the pandemic, the wartime spirit.
And I have to say, family tales, which I'm not going to spoil Pete here, but there were ladies in our family who had a lovely time, including welcoming the Americans, but we were So, on behalf of us all, Books and Beverages,
Was there any more things? Sorry, I thought it was somebody else's hand up.
come and talk to Susanna when it's much easier, isn't it?
Yeah. But please come and have a look at anything. There's no beer in here before you think about it.
But very wartime.
Okay, thank you very much for
Thanks very much.